Hi, everybody. Fantastic to be here for this Hacking Democracy COG Extra, put together by COGX, of course, but also in conjunction with Fabric. I'm the managing partner of Fabric Ventures and thrilled to be here. So it is impossible not to notice the swirling impact of the US election around us and this incredible sight of Twitter warnings as to the validity or the falsehood indeed, or likely falsehood of statements made by the current, at least, sitting president of the United States. And I think in that context, it couldn't be more timely, although it continues to be timely on an ongoing basis to think about the state of democracy and how vulnerable it is to assault. And whilst we might have thought about it being vulnerable to assault, perhaps by kind of adversaries or kind of foreign nation states or agents or actors, it seems like there's an equal amount of threat internally these days. I think maybe just stepping back a little bit to what Fabric is about, we have a thesis that revolves around the open economy, the rise of the open economy. And that's underpinned by actually the new ability with technology to take control, to take ownership of your individual identity, of your data, and indeed the networks within which we actually habitually sort of run our everyday lives. And if you think about it, it's actually the enforcement of this property that allows us, this personal property that allows us to build amazing new companies, perhaps to reestablish a model for dealing with digital columns, for example, perhaps the social graph that Facebook has built its business upon. And then also I think it is being able to prove that a citizen has earned their right to vote and to ensure that vote is counted, that element of kind of property rights that underpins sort of society itself and indeed democracy. And I think, it's important to think that, to reflect on the fact that democracy is not just a concept that is a pure principle that is understood and extremely well established. It's relatively new and fragile, and in fact it's possibly not even a concept or a principle at all. It's really a set of technologies itself. So it's not surprising that technology can both threaten it, but also be used perhaps to establish a greater level of resilience for it. And so I think those three questions that we have in our thesis are actually the kind of pretty closely allied to the current attack vectors on democracy. That is, who are the voters? Can we be sure of who is voting? Can we be sure that we've counted the votes? And perhaps something currently that's kind of wrapping all those together, can we be sure of what the truth is? And I think I'd like to add one more to that, which is, can we use technology to move us from a world of getting by in terms of social media, being vaguely literate, to being highly competent, because I think that's going to be important to be a citizen, an effective citizen moving forward. So you can discover more about Fabric on our website and follow us on Twitter and all of those kind of things. But to kick us off, I would like to introduce a panel that is going to look specifically at how the open web, the set of technologies that underpin this burgeoning open economy, or Web3 as it's sometimes called, can actually help democracy out. And I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Stephen Seven Waterhouse. He's actually the founder of Awkward Protocol, one of our portfolio companies, and a long-term collaborator of mine, to moderate this session and to introduce the rest of the panel and dig in deeply to these topics. Seven, can I pass over to you, please?
So we're here to talk about kind of Web3, help democracy, which is very opportune given recent events. For those of you watching this in the future, it's middle November in 2020, just after the US election. I'm joined by an illustrious panel. Cory Doctorow, who is a well-known author, activist, and journalist. Harry Halpin, who's the CEO and co-founder of NIM. This is kind of cool, they're just appearing as I see them. Aaron Smith, who is author of Identity Reboot. Come on in, Aaron. and Vinay Gupta, who's CEO of Mataran. And I am Stephen Waterhouse, CEO and co-founder of Orchid. All right, hi everybody. So it's been quite a year, and and it's been quite a year for democracy. It's been a year for the collection of things we call Web3, the industry that we all, most of us work in. I wanted to just get a little sense from each of you about how your work has the kind of work you are really focused on right now, and also how it's changed this year. We don't need to do a full COVID introduction like we do in most meetings. Just get a little sense of your belief around the collection of technologies or other things that we call Web3. I think of it as decentralized systems, and how it relates to democracy today and in the future. And we'll start from there. So maybe starting with you, Corey.
Yeah, I guess the big shift that I've experienced in the last year is the extent to which all of these issues have come into focus as being related to competition and monopoly, and how that seems to connect with a lot of other issues that are ongoing in our world, where the problems of right to repair and Medtronic ventilators seem hard to separate from the questions of technology companies being able to dominate the way that our kids are learning, or the way that our news is being handled, and so on. The fact that Twitter is putting misinformation notices next to the president's speech is significant, but what's even more significant is the fact that the president really has no choice but to remain on Twitter, endure the indignity, and simply complain about it, that we don't have a multiplicity of public squares where the president can go and engage in speech on rules that suit him. And, it's fine, he's the president. But there are lots of people who have a lot less social clout who struggle with this issue in a way that's a lot more salient.
Thanks, Barry. I see you touching on a number of points there, which I'm very familiar with your work. I don't want to say I'm a fanboy, but I'm familiar with work. And I know all the work you've been looking at around the issues of copyright and people's freedom or lack thereof to actually be able to change the software and hardware they're using, and how that affects people's lives.
Yeah, well, what I would say is that, and I guess if we're talking about things that changed in 2020, is that I've come to understand and make peace with the term IP. Generally speaking, if you talk to copyright activists, they hate the term IP. They say, oh, it's not property, it's imprecise. You're talking about trademarks, you're talking about copyrights. It's hard to tell. Why don't you talk about the thing you're talking about? What I've come to realize is that the colloquial but very precise meaning of IP in a commercial context is any law, rule, or regulation that allows a firm to reach out beyond its boundary and control the conduct of its competitors, its critics, and its customers. And, whether that is anti-circumvention rules being invoked to decide who can perform security audits of products or reveal defects in them, or Goldman Sachs releasing a free font called Goldman Sans that you can distribute freely all you want. It's licensed for free distribution, but it comes with a non-disparagement clause in the license agreement that says that you won't make fun of Goldman Sachs. And so, the nature of IP is really revealed there. They don't need copyright to control who gets to use their font. They need copyright to control what expression can emerge from their font. And, that's funny when it comes to them. But when you see IP being deployed to decide who can fix a ventilator or a tractor, or who can describe the defects in remote proctoring services being used by our institutes of higher education, this becomes a lot more salient, right? There are students who are already at a disadvantage, who, the way that they get their connectivity is by driving to a fast food restaurant and sitting in the car park and doing their remote education that way because of monopolies in telecoms. That means that they can't get broadband or can't get it at a price that makes sense. And now they're being subject to remote proctoring that, because their environment is, quote, anomalous, an algorithm already automatically downranks them and prevents them from proceeding in their education. And so it's as with so many of our technology dysfunctions, if you want to observe what your own future looks like, start with the people who have no power at all, because the terrible technology adoption curve begins with victimizing people who don't get to complain, knocks the rough edges off, and then works its way up the privilege gradient to someone who looks like you and me. 20 years ago, if you were eating dinner and there was a CCTV watching you, it was because you were in a supermax prison. Today, it's because you were unwise enough to buy a home automation system.
Yes. Thank you, Corey. Harry, you want to see if you can follow that on? But at least tell us a little about your work.
Yeah, so I work on privacy networks. We have a sort of system called a mixed net, which is meant to withstand what we call nation-state level adversaries that can watch all the inputs, outputs of the network. And we try to make it so people can be anonymous when communicating, even against what we call NSA level adversaries. Now, I think what 2020 has really shown is, there's truly, I do believe people in the United States worked very hard to stay within the democratic system. So you saw, I was quite surprised. I've left the US a long time ago. I live overseas. But what I noticed was all of my younger friends, they really got together and they were incredibly enthused about participating in the democratic process. And to be honest, mostly voting for Sanders. Then we saw that strangely overcome by Biden. And we saw a electoral race where the polls claimed for Biden landslide. That obviously didn't happen. Biden barely acted out. And now we're seeing an argument over the legitimacy of the democratic process itself inside the United States. And what that has brought to bear is a number of things. First thing, the United States is obviously not a model for democratic governance in electoral processes that make any sense. All of the ugliness of the Electoral College, the various anti-democratic procedures put into the U.S. governance has all been kind of revealed for all to see. Also, what appears to be a grade, maybe Vinay will address this, a sort of 1970s style voting procedures where votes take days to come in and no one really knows. And then I think what worries me, but also gives me great hope, is that while it does seem like the United States, which previously would make fun of countries that had issues with elections, now appears to be a country which itself cannot run an election and which itself does not have a clear president in the future due to Trump resisting the Biden transition team. This is a situation which in most countries besides the United States, you would say is a setup for a sort of civil war, a setup for a general breakdown of governance. Now, I doubt that will happen. The U.S. military is very strong, but I've been in countries. I was in Egypt when Morsi was replaced by the Sisi coup. The Sisi coup was widely supported by most of the left-wing people in Tahrir Square. And all of a sudden you're in a situation where you don't know who has the right to shut down your telephone. You don't know who has the right to arrest you. You don't know who has the right to come into your house, or it's quite unclear. And then last year I spent some time in Syria, and in Syria it's the same situation, except you don't know who has the right to kill you. It's unclear who should be checking your car at various border stops. And I think although this situation seems to be something which happens only in other countries, it's increasingly evident that this may be the destiny of the United States itself. And I do think that the censorship resistance, privacy-based technologies which don't have trusted third parties, which is the point of Web3, I think will have an important role to play both in preserving knowledge, allowing people to communicate when there are nation-state level breakdowns or platform level breakdowns, and could be incredibly important just to maintain our ability to self-organize in the midst of the general sort of decline of the Westphalian nation-state infrastructure. So I'm pretty excited about the future of Web3. I'm pretty bearish on the future of the United States government and nation-states in general.
Yeah, it reminds me of the situation with COVID. It's like everything is fine once we have the vaccine, as long as we get that. The other thing that my commentary on that was I was actually watching a TED talk that was done. I'll find the link so we can send around. A few months before the election, and the speaker was talking about what would happen if a president didn't concede. And it turns out that there is actually a way to continue being president if you don't concede. And he lays it out, and it's sort of kind of theoretical, but I hope that's not where we're going. But it's certainly we're off topic here because like we're in the weeds of politics. It is a dangerous situation that we see in right now.
No, I agree 100%. And I think we're going to need technologies like ORCID, like NEM, like Materium and things to rebuild the society, but also to survive what could be a very dangerous transitionary period, which is not something that's constrained to quote unquote developing countries, but which is something now we're seeing in the quote unquote West. And the supposedly stable and core developed countries are now having systemic governance issues.
Yeah. Alan, tell us a little bit about what you've been up to and your concerns and your hopes for the future.
Thank you. So my own focus is viewing digital identity as a gateway to data ethics. And particularly this year, I've seen the link that was always there between information and outcomes in democracy becoming absolutely undeniable. So I would argue that information increasingly determines what we believe on the fundamental level, but also what options we perceive as being available. The fact that President Donald Trump is currently refusing to concede, the fact that that is even an option, those seeds have been planted meticulously for a very long time. Then from there, so first it determines what we believe, then it determines what options we think we have available, but then it also ultimately steers what we choose to do. And I believe that online, when we consume information, that information is served to us based on our digital identity. So the more accurate this identity, the more impactful the nudge or the steer towards certain behavior. And in a sense, this is the feeding ground for the current disinformation crisis. And we do see that relationship playing out with politics. So to just take you through like a little timeline, the way we view our information environment and the vulnerability of ourselves therein has definitely evolved. So these are 3 articles, all from The Guardian. And in 2012, they wrote that the headline read something like this. So Obama, Facebook, and the power of friendship. So the 2012 data election. It was 2012, and the usage of personal information was internal, so it was domestic in the context of the US election, but it was also perceived as being benevolent. Then in 2016, that narrative definitely changed. The headline then read, Cambridge Analytica, is democracy itself threatened by tech disruption? So the link was already being made between information and the overall sustainability of democracy. And the angle there became that disinformation was external and it was malign. The Russians are doing it, right? Then in 2020, and this is the reality that we live in right now, the headline read, Putin could only dream of it, how Trump became the biggest source of disinformation in 2020. And what is different there is that the toxicity of information is internal and it is malign. So what we've started to see is that there is a normalization of disinformation into politics. And you can see the systematic conflicts coming out more and more in the information environment, resulting in this really weird situation that there's more information than ever before, but we feel we know less.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the sort of general concept of what is true and how does that belief in the truth or belief that there is some kind of truth is certainly one of the best issues we're facing now with misinformation. Vinay, tell us a little about what you've been up to.
Sure.
What do you think about this one?
So, I mean, the majority of what I'm doing on this front is trying to figure out how to build global courts for commerce. And you don't immediately think, hey, you know, global courts, commerce, what does this have to do with democracy? But my feeling is that we just can't fix democracy inside of the nation state framework. The problem is that we need to migrate enormous amounts of power to the global level so that we can do things like international management of climate. And we have to do this in a way that creates a whole modernized 21st century civil rights framework, because we're still looking at civil rights in much the same way that we did centuries ago in most countries. You know, we haven't figured out things like right to privacy. We haven't figured out things like the rights of future generations to inherit a planet that still basically works ecologically. So I'm definitely kind of wedged far, far in the future, largely because I think the nation state fight for democracy is pretty well staffed and has become a very, very difficult kind of ground and pound operation with, you know, bunches of lawyers and very hard dug in activists. And I'm trying to get a little bit above that fray and say, okay, in 15 years, what are we going to need in terms of global governance? And how do we make sure that when we get that global governance in place, it doesn't turn out to be the worst of the current system, running into this untapped horizon for control that you get as we begin to implement sensible management of long-term climate. The thing that is kind of key to me in this struggle is the notion that if the jurisdictions are the wrong shape and the wrong size, they will inevitably be broken. So, you know, America is kind of too big to work as a democracy if you wind up with gigantic concentrations of power in Washington, D.C., and an electoral system that doesn't adequately represent the interests of people that live in urban areas. Like, okay, it's broken at onset. And you have to go and, you know, really look at these fundamental assumptions around things like the Electoral College. But you come to the UK, you have very similar problems. Only here, the issues in democracy are largely driven by things like land access. We don't really know who owns good chunks of this country. We have enormous amounts of anti-democratic collusion inside of institutions like the House of Lords. So, you know, the thing that I want to drive at here is that over the next century, and we have to be thinking on that kind of scale, technology regulation is going to be the single biggest challenge for global governance. Right? Today, we're still dealing with the fallout from coal plants, which are not exactly high tech. Now we have this enormous problem with these huge seas of toxic data manipulation. Right on the back of that, we're going to have another round with AI. And then behind that, we're going to have questions like who's allowed to mine the asteroids and what happens if you sling them around and one goes astray. Right, what happens? So, to me, I think that the defensive line, like the skirmish line, the main battle is for democracy in the nation state level. And, you know, we have a lot of forces kind of dug in at that level. But the skirmish line is long-term global and indeed interplanetary regulation of technology. And, you know, that is basically the domain of science fiction, right? I do a bunch of work as futurist, in addition to running Materium. I sketched out an outline of some stuff about this kind of global governance stuff in a sort of throwaway novel I did for National Novel Writing Month about 10 years ago. And what I'm building, although it appears to be a global court for commerce, contains within it the seeds of subsequent courts that could look at things like AI regulation. And you get these kind of global courts to function by forming consortia of technology companies, civil society actors, and various other kinds of agency inside of bodies that have the ability to make law inside of self-regulating organizations. And the bottom line is that if you break those laws, you get kicked out of the SROs. Those kind of structures to me look like they've got the potential flexibility and dexterity for doing long-term self-governance of technology. with the hope being that if you could get the technology companies to self-regulate effectively, and I know that sounds like a joke today, but it's not going to be that way in future, you have the potential of keeping this stuff out of the hair of the nation-state governments, who are so inept at technology regulation, they just hand the entire thing over to lobbyists. So, this stuff is still very written on water. It's very, very, very light and speculative. But that's really where I'm focused. How do we build global courts with jurisdiction in specific areas, largely using the framework from the 1958 New York Convention on Arbitration, which gives people the ability to create private courts? And it's definitely walking a razor's edge. This work is, it's okay in the hands of people that are good. In the hands of people that are bad, it will be very dangerous. And I feel like we're in a race against things like, take your pick for the potential venues that we could see instead of these kind of approaches.
Thanks, Vinay. As you were talking, it joined a couple of questions from some thinking through what are going to be big political issues of the century. We're already facing a bunch of things that we're thinking about with global pandemic and immigration, sort of the collapse of superpowers and the emergence of other ones, European Union, we have the list of these things. In the end, a number of things I read just basically said, all this will matter, but what's really going to matter this century is climate. And at some point, that is just the defining moment for essentially all political parties. And we start to see this already with situations like Syria, and then emigration from a region that has not just conflict, but also climate issues, and then how that then affects, for example, the composition of German democracies and German parliamentary situations, where you start seeing more right-wing emergence as more immigrants start coming in. So I wonder, kind of in your work, is that something you're thinking particularly about as the emergence of climate as a strong issue people are going to have to start paying significant attention to?
So the thing about climate is we just don't have any governance which is the right shape to handle climate. We got nothing. The UN is a joke when it comes to these kind of issues. You could potentially see some kind of deal between the European Union and China, and then if they can drag India into that, they've got about half the world's population, about half the world's economy. But we just don't have anything like the kind of representative structures required. And there is some technology that might help with this. So David Chaum, who's obviously the father of digital cash, one of the great godfathers of cryptography, has put a ton of work into a thing called random sample voting. And the basic idea is that if you have an accurate global voters roll, then you can randomly pick people using cryptographically secure sources of randomness, and then you can contact those people and ask their opinions. And if those opinions are sort of 60-40 weighted or something like that, you might only need a sample size of 10,000 people to give you a truly statistically certain perspective on what the world thinks about an issue. The closer you get to 50-50, the more people you need to ask. And you're obviously never going to start that game with a perfect global voters roll. But if you wind up with a global voters roll which is 3/4 of the population and is, say, connected to their mobile phones, you can then apply statistical models to try and guess what you do with the gaps in the data. And if the uncertainty in the data gaps is larger than the measured certainty of the population's opinion, you just wind up having to put a question mark on it and saying we need more data, we need a better voters roll. So those sort of approaches to me look like the possibility of the radical reinvention of democracy at the global level at affordable cost, based on principles like sortition, which we use for things like jury trials. And a global body based on that principle would initially largely be advisory. It's got no power, but in the longer run, right, if that global advisory body makes better decisions than the nation-state governments, you could see the emergence of political parties that dedicate themselves to voting in alignment with that global body. And I think those approaches are definitely in the domain of science fiction, but people like David Chaum are the kind of people that take science fiction and turn it into reality at scale. And I think that those kinds of radicalism we have to put a little bit of work into that skirmish line so that if we win the battle in the short run, we've got the ability to take the next step forward. And likewise, if we lose the battle, we have a rallying point, which is 20 years in the future relative to where the nation state's understanding of the problem is. I'm not saying this in instead of the nation state level fight that we're all involved in, but I think there are future horizons for the struggle for human decency in the face of human stupidity and evil.
Thank you. So I guess when we think about democracy, we're both thinking about the actual mechanics of how democracy works, like how voting works, how government works, things like governance. But we're also thinking about the things that influence democracy and can subvert it, can take it in a direction which is something which we think of as no longer democracy. Such as sort of a one-party state or an oligarch or these kind of different of structures. And so as we think through both these two things, so let's look at things that can disrupt a democracy, whether it's misinformation. We've touched on these things a little bit so far already. And manipulation of media, manipulation of information, maybe censorship, in the sense that sometimes censorship seems a good thing for democracy, sometimes it's a bad thing for democracy. Maybe we can touch upon sort of the behavior of Twitter during this the last few months, and the extent that they've been shifting from being seen as a publisher or not a publisher, and are they a platform? Which one of these things are they when they're adding in the editorial feed? Because currently, for those who are opposing the previous regime, or hopefully the regime, might think that these were good. But what if these comments were on candidates that you liked? Like, what if it was the other way around? What if the platforms were being controlled in a different way? So, if each of you could talk a little bit about your thoughts on the sort of the threats to democracy and how and the process of democracy, and how Web3, these decentralized techniques or other techniques can help. And then also the sort of the mechanics of democracy, the aspects of voting and governance and so on that Web3 can enable, because that's certainly an area that it seems a lot of promise so far.
Maybe Corey, you want to go for it?
Yeah, sure. So I think that we live in obviously a very technologically intensive moment, and there are a lot of really hard questions about surviving from day to day and moment to moment that we can't individually resolve. To know whether or not you should get a given vaccine, or whether you should wear a mask, or whether your kid's distance education curriculum is sufficient, or whether you should get on a 737 MAX, or whether the reinforced steel joist over your head is made of a sufficiently strong alloy that your roof isn't going to fall in on you. These are all questions that maybe smart people could figure out the answer to themselves if you really sat down and bore down on the books and read a lot of articles and meta reviews, but you couldn't answer all of them, right? Not if you live to 150 years. And so we rely on these external mechanisms where the process is legible, right? Where you have truth-seeking exercises in democratic states, where neutral third parties adjudicate contradictory claims from the different experts, and then try to cut through them and tell you what they think is true, and also recuse themselves when they have conflicts and so on. And as that process is broken down, and I think that we can all point to examples in which it's broken down in really ghastly ways. I mean, the opioid epidemic would be a good example, or the 737 MAX, our ability to know what is true, in fact, our ability to know how we know something is true, has broken down. And I think this is the great threat to the idea of a polity, of a democracy, because as we replace a legible process that tells us what's true with nothing, people just flail around. I mean, you can't go through the world not knowing whether or not you should vaccinate your kids, or whether or not you should get on a 737 MAX. You have to form an opinion. And in the absence of an institution you trust, we tend to fall back on these personality cults. And we end up just finding someone who sounds like they know what they're talking about and trusting that they're getting it right. And this is a dire threat to democracy. I mean, when we look at the growth of conspiratorial beliefs, including conspiratorial cults like QAnon, we tend to focus on the outlandishness of their beliefs. But really, the more interesting and important question is how they arrived at them. And, there are some people who say that they got there because Google invented a mind control ray to sell you a fidget spinner, and then Robert Mercer stole it and made everyone racist. But I think a more, testable, disprovable, and evidence-supported explanation is that conspiracies arise out of the direct experience with corruption. That corruption and conspiracy are just two sides of the same coin, and that trauma makes conspiracy seem especially plausible. And if you've lost a loved one to the opioid epidemic or to the disastrous British plan to create herd immunity in the early days of the pandemic, or any of the other things that where monopoly and a lack of attention to evidence has collapsed trust in our institutions, then you are traumatized. And, a planet of traumatized people who don't know how to know whether something is true, who don't even have a framework on which to agree, the basis on which they would adjudicate a contradictory claim, is no place for a democracy. It's no place where democracy can take hold. And so I think we need to strike at the root. And Vinay, you had some interesting suggestions for exotic voting systems and so on, which I think are all very good and interesting. But, I would settle for like procurement guidelines that just said no government agency is going to buy a product from any company unless they promise to forswear all legal tools they could use to block interoperability and security auditing. Like that would go a long way. We had this chance when the NHS was debating whether or not they were going to put like buttons on NHS pages, where they concluded that they wouldn't, which, probably the right call. But they could have instead done what the Obama administration did with YouTube, where they said, look, we'd like to continue the president's fireside chats that he started as a campaigning senator with YouTube, but White House privacy rules don't let us do it because you harvest too much data. And YouTube responded by saying, "Great, here's a version of YouTube that doesn't gather any data. If you just put YouTube no cookie into the start of the URL instead of YouTube, you will get YouTube with no data collection." We could have done the same thing with the NHS. We could have said, "Give us a like button that only collects data when you share it." And so that I think is a lever that we could use to improve some competition and get us free of this epistemological chaos.
Yeah, I mean, I was actually let me make one or two little comments. So I was in the room when Dave Ricordan pushed through the Facebook like button. I had to sign an NDA, so I'm not going to talk about it. But at the time, I was working on interoperability, and we sort of had this theory that maybe the like button could share data with all sorts of different kinds of people. It ends up it didn't have to. And we didn't think it was going to have we did not at the time predict what huge amounts of influence Facebook and social media would have. And but that being said, I would like to push back a bit on what I call the fake news narrative that's somehow special to Facebook. It's really clear Facebook is very good at spreading disinformation. I'm not going to argue with that. But nonetheless, so is television. I am from the South of the United States. My parents voted for Obama, and they also voted for Trump in 2016. And the reason is very simple. They believe, and I think the media establishment has not fully reckoned with this, that the Iraq war was the giant movement of what they considered mass media manipulation and disinformation. And that's true, right? We went to war with yellow cake? I mean, it was ridiculous. And I think a lot of people got severely distrustful, people who are not necessarily, ordinary people. My parents, you could, barely, not even use a mouse very well, became very distrustful of television and of mainstream media. And they went to Facebook because Facebook presents different kinds of facts, some of which are more correct. For example, they discovered what actually, the connections between Halliburton and all of the stuff was discovered by them on Facebook. And I think while I do believe that there is tremendous responsibility on these large platforms, they're private entities. It's going to be very hard to force them to change, to restrict them. You can use monopoly law, something that's highly unlikely to work. We live in a global world, as Vinay pointed out. And second, the fundamental problem of fake news is actually a problem which we've had since the beginning of radio, which is propaganda. And the reason why we're seeing propaganda more and more in the United States is because we're all now a little bit more on the receiving end of it than we used to be. But if you go to anyone who lived anywhere outside the United States, or at least Western Europe, of course, there was lots of propaganda done by the United States to other countries over television and radio. So I think what's happening is that this whole process, which predates the internet, of spreading information, trying to make decisions about it, trying to understand it, siding with your tribe, forming democratic governance with other people, this has now just become global. And it does have highly centralized points of control. And I do think by decentralizing it, using Web3 technologies, we can create more community-enforced standards, community-enforced governance, and less, I would say, easy to corrupt institutions and technological infrastructure. So rather than restrict internet access or encourage content moderation, which is just another word for censorship, I think we should just call it what it is. And maybe censorship is okay sometimes if you think it is, and it's your platform, but maybe we should encourage people to have their own platforms, their own decentralized processes, their own processes, which may or may not agree with what we want, but it might be what they want. And I'm okay with that, because I think if you look back on things historically, I think the vast amount of propaganda has not come from Facebook. It hasn't come from Putin. It came from the United States government over the Iraq War. And I will draw that line in the sand. And I think that's what led to Trump.
Let me push back a little bit on that. So I agree with some of your points, but I do think that the strength of a lie or any spin depends on the effectiveness of reaching a person most likely to actually believe that lie or spin or other version of the truth. And I think that part of the it's a bit sad, really, but part of the reason why the status of democracy, particularly in the United States, is now so dire is that we are seeing a gradual hollowing out of institutions, which is due to many, many, many factors, partly due to the polarization in politics, and their respective bases. But it's also can partly be ascribed to what Vinay was already saying, that we are facing problems on a global scale, and that the institutions as they currently are unfortunately not equipped to react to that. We see it with COVID. We are living in a globalized world. You cannot all of a sudden retract back into nation states and organize responses from there. It has to have a global element. You see it in climate change. And we don't know where the next global crisis is going to come from. But we definitely need to make sure that the structures from an institutional level all the way up to the tech that enables that, and the public buy-in that underpins that. We need to make sure that is future-proof. Otherwise, the future will inform us of our mistakes down the line.
In fact, if I could build on that, I think that the underlying diagnosis is that what we're seeing is future shock. The institutions are unable to adapt to the rate of change, particularly from this combination of globalization on multiple different fronts, the internet, container shipping, and so on. So you have, extremely accelerated globalization, and then you also have extremely accelerated technological change. And what we're discovering is the institutions are just unable to act because the rate of change of the institutions is so much slower than the rate of change in the world. And the oldest institution that we have is 4-year representative electoral democracy, where people come and put X's on pieces of paper. I think the only thing older than that might be jury trials. So, this notion that what we have is institutional tearing produced by a rate of change that they can't manage, that was commonly understood inside of the esoteric bits of the Department of Defense more than a generation ago. This idea that the OODA loop of reality, was just moving faster than the department could adapt to, created an enormous amount of transformation. There was this whole thing, the revolution in military affairs, which was an enormous, almost intergenerational project to try and figure out how to deal with technological change. But the rest of government didn't have that. And, that problem of we just have no, we almost need this embassy of the future, right? We need some ability to have some part of every country which says, okay, our relationship is with the future. We are the 20-year embassy. We're the 50-year embassy. We're the 150-year embassy. Because we don't build political machinery for interfacing with the future, we're just going to wind up with these archaic institutions that are so unable to react to the world that we're in and the world that we're going into. They're stuck in perpetual failure. And then you get the perpetual cover-up of the perpetual failure, and the perpetual cover-up winds up enforced by the damn police state, and off you go to the races. Mm-hmm. If you look at the Stalin and Mao, covering up failure was a critical function of those governments. Corey?
Yeah, I want to push back a little bit. I mean, I want to say that while there are definitely impedance mismatches between the speed at which our institutions work and the regulatory questions that they face, that I've been hearing the story that lawmakers make bad tech law because they're old and irrelevant for 20 years now. And I don't recognize it in the field, right? I have been in the room when bad tech policy was made, and it wasn't because of the elderly irrelevance of the lawmakers involved. It was because they were being unduly influenced by industry and didn't have a source of independent expertise. Lawmakers with no particular technical expertise navigate matters of life and death every single day. The reason you're not dead 1,000 times over of cholera is because a bunch of lawmakers, none of whom is a molecular biologist, still manage to create policy that keeps your water safe. And so I think that it lets them off too easy to say that the problem is that they're old and lack the context and expertise. I think that they know how to make good policy. They choose not to make good policy because their incentives are aligned to make bad policy. The reason that the FDA let the Sacklers sell enough OxyContin to kick off the opioid epidemic and kill 200,000 Americans more than died in the Vietnam War was not because they lacked the capacity to evaluate the strength of the evidence about the safety of opioids. It's because they chose not to exercise that capacity.
So, this is the two great theories of why the world is broken, right? You can either have evil or you can have incompetence, and I think we both believe that it's a pretty good mix of each. As for, how this is going to roll, let's remember that this is not just a US problem, right? The European Union, although it seems superficially to be doing much better than the US in terms of democracy, is probably only 5 or 10 years behind the US in having, large-scale right-wing meltdown. China has just seen a position where they had a somewhat pluralistic top tier of government implode into a kind of dictator for life situation. This stuff is not restricted to the US ecology. And part of why I think that it's largely driven by rate of change is the fact that it seems to be everywhere simultaneously. Even in the non-democratic countries, we seem to be going through institutional failure and collapse. I do want to very much stress that this is a two-fight situation, right? There is an immediate problem, which is exactly the kind of territory that you're talking about, and then there's a 15 years out kind of frontier where we need to get at least some of the basic moves sketched out early, because 15 years passes in the blink of an eye. And I think we do have to fight on both fronts. We have to fight here, and we have to fight a generation out.
All right.
Speaking of a blink of an eye, Stephen, what's your...
Yes. I'm going to try to wrap this up a little bit, everybody. I could probably talk to all of you for another hour or two because it's fascinating.
Getting started.
Yeah, so some really good minds and some good opinions here. I was going to ask each of you, because this year seems to have been such an acceleration of history. I was going to ask each of you to try and close, if you can, by very quickly. If you're from the future, looking back at 2020, and sure, you can have the obvious things like the pandemic and so on, but what's the one thing that changed in 2020 if you're looking back from the future? And then we'll wrap it up. Corey, you're up.
All right. I want to preface my remarks by saying that as a science fiction writer, I'm keenly aware that people who claim to know the future are either kidding you or kidding themselves, or possibly both. So
Right.
that said, I will say that my hope is that 2021 is the year in which people who are being harmed by monopolies in lots of different ways, whether that's because the cost of their eyeglasses have gone up 1,000% since one Italian company bought every eyewear brand, or because there are only two major brewers left in the world, or the big four accounting firms keep letting companies like Carillion barrel towards to collapse, or what have you, that they all realize that what they're interested in is not accounting fraud or beer or professional wrestling or eyewear or the future of the web, that they're all interested in monopoly, and that they actually are all fighting on the same fight, in the same way that at a certain point we tipped over from people thinking that they cared about owls or whales or the ozone layer, and realizing they cared about the ecology, and that they were all on the same side.
Thank you.
I would just say that.
I think that's Harry. Sorry.
I'm sorry. I would just say that 2020 is the year in which we finally saw, I think, the U.S. hegemony peak. We saw capitalism itself decelerate, and it's really make it or break it for our generation to put together both the political and the technical infrastructure that I, hopefully coming from the future, will have to live in. And I am confident this generation and Generation Z can actually do it. So I'm actually, despite that I'm worried about what's going on, I'm very positive about the capabilities of using the internet to have the younger people in the future, our future selves, solve these problems.
Great answer, thank you. Aaron?
I think looking back, we're going to see 2020 as the year where our problems kind of outgrew nation states. And I do think that from here onwards, we will see global problems that are more and more interconnected, and democracy and nation states, as we currently know them, will be less and less able to react to them. I do think that's a tipping point.
Okay, and thank you. And finally, Vinay.
Yeah. So, I used to work pretty closely with government, specifically on large-scale disasters, including pandemics. And I was appalled by how just completely crappy and incompetent government planning was for more or less any large-scale problem, from earthquakes through to nuclear war. It was all just garbage. And we saw this unfold with Iraq and Afghanistan, where the Western powers killed pretty much 1 million civilians in those wars on cooked-up evidence that was entirely irrelevant to 9/11. And now we've seen, the same kind of combination of evil and incompetence kill, probably by the time we're done, several million people with COVID. I mean, maybe if we get the vaccine thing worked out, it'll be just about 2 million. Globally, probably 500,000 in America. So I think now we've sort of had our final wake-up call on this combination of evil and incompetence, which is at the heart of government. We have to go and clean this thing out like an abscess or a root canal. Because if we don't get that thing fixed, the next thing around the corner is only going to be worse than the current one. The pressure from climate, the pressure from AI, the pressure from any one of a number of unanticipated risks, it's just going to increase and increase and increase the need for nimble, agile, accurate governance. And to me, the big danger to democracy here is the efficiency of regimes like Singapore, where they have a state which is, generally speaking, on the side of its people, as long as the people don't have too much to say about how they want things to be, right? They're generally well-intentioned. It's a very Confucian kind of situation, but it's so outperforming other governments on so many fronts, and it's not the only example of that kind. So I kind of feel like if we don't figure out how to get an agile democracy that's capable of coping with things like COVID, increasingly you're going to see people kind of taking a look at the autocracies and just being like, those guys have a couple of things worked out. And the recent climate pledge from China, if I remember correctly, carbon neutral by 2050. It doesn't take too much more of autocracies showing that kind of global leadership for us to lose democracy as a principle. So we really need to treat this as a fundamental, enduring crisis of democracy, and we need to be relentless about upgrading it until the democracies perform so well that nobody is even tempted by autocracy. It's going to be a big, big time.
It's a fascinating question to end this on. I'm going to wrap this session up. Thank you so much. It was fascinating talking to all of you and hearing your ideas and the interactions. And I want to thank our hosts for having us here, and look forward to talking with each of you soon. Thank you.
Splendid. Really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Want access to more CogX videos? Subscribe now for free at cogx.co.